Hi everyone. I put together this quick presentation to talk you through some interesting research that relates to your brain and light, and how some fascinating discoveries recently in the past 5 to 10 years imply that our body is receptive and influenced by light in ways that not many people really understand. So, to give you a quick background, for those who don't know, the terrestrial sunlight, or the radiation that we get from the sun on planet Earth, standing on the ground, is a combination of visible and non-visible light. So what we can see or perceive is going to be between 400 and 700 nanometers of wavelength. But what is also important for our a range of biological function is ultraviolet light, which is below visible, and infrared light, which is above visible. And these have, in addition to things like vitamin D synthesis, they've got a range of very important impacts on our biological function. But what I want to talk about is this fascinating idea that light can penetrate the skull of mammals, and this has been known for over 30, 40 years. And I want to talk you through this quite old experiment, but which is very interesting. So the background to this is that these researchers had known that light was affecting animals, and it was affecting biological function. So they make the point here that uh, Benoit and associates have shown that testicular weight is increased in ducks when the ducks are exposed to appropriate amounts of visible light, and that was related to increased secretion of pituitary gonadotrophins. So again, that's part of the pituitary hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, which is what regulates our sex hormone production. So they noticed that light was influencing this process. So they also noticed that light can penetrate through the skull into the intracranial structures. So the hypothesis back then was that light is not only acting on the eyes, but also on an intracranial receptor to produce this increase in gonadotrophin, which was causing the duck's testicles to grow larger. So we've known for a very long time that light can influence sexual behavior and influence sexual differentiation. So what did they do in this study? So what they did is they took a receptive photovoltaic capsule and put it inside the brain of a range of mammals. And what they did then is shined a light on these brains of these animals to measure whether the light was being penetrated inside the skull. What they found is that this was the case, and that they could pick up light that was essentially being shone from as far as 24 inches away into the brains. So, what does this mean in terms of what we know at the moment? Well, I had a recent interview with Scott Zimmerman, and he's an optics engineer who's written a fascinating paper called Melatonin and the Optics of the Human Body. And what he details in that paper was that our brains have a fascinating capability of essentially harvesting near infrared light. So what they showed is that the cerebral spinal fluid, which is essentially the liquid bath which bathes your spinal cord and your brain, and has a range of functions that are essential in keeping everything working properly, that they were actually able to scatter near infrared light that was coming from the sun, from the environment, and concentrating it into the grooves of your brain. So specifically the gray matter. And they had the fascinating idea, or the presupposition was that why is our gray matter so close to the surface? And was it possibly because it was designed to or adapted to absorb this near infrared light that was being absorbed? And the effect of that near infrared light in your cells is to essentially make melatonin inside the mitochondria of all those cells. And I won't go further than that, but I really highly recommend listening to my interview with Scott and reading his paper, Melatonin and the Optics of the Human Body, because it is truly groundbreaking stuff. So what they said, which is essentially what I've just explained to you, is that the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, surrounding the brain optically acts as a light guide, distributing the near infrared photons, scattering off the surface of the brain, and even into the deep folds of the brain. So, and he makes a comparison to industrial and automotive uses that have similar light guides to kind of direct light. So they, as I said, they make the conclusion that the brain appears to be optically designed to distribute near-infrared photons to the grey matter, even down to the folds of the brain. And the fact that the grey matter is localized on the outside of the surface is consistent with this idea that the near infrared is beneficial to the grey matter. So those two, I guess, findings together imply that our brain is using light and is receptive to light. So keep that in mind as we talk about that as we move on to the next point. So the next thing I want to explain to you very briefly is the photoreceptor system. And what I mean by that is we have systems of recognizing light, and those are visual and non-visual photoreceptor systems. So the visual photoreceptors are they're basically our way of forming images. So think about a camera function, and if you were to see something, if you see your friend, if you went to go into nature to look at a tree, the visual photoreceptors are and the rods and the cone cells are actually the mechanism by which you are able to perceive form and image. But we also have non-visual photoreceptors, and think about a detector. So if the visual photoreceptors are giving us an idea about form, these non-visual photoreceptors are detecting the presence or absence of specific wavelengths of light. And so what they essentially are there for is to help us entrain our circadian rhythm and detect the ambient light in our environment to then inform our body of what's going on from a light point of view, which again is going to help influence all our bodily functions. So there's a couple of classes of these non-visual photoreceptors, and I've talked about melanopsin before, but there's also neuropsin and cephalopsin are other non-visual photoreceptors. And essentially, melanopsin detects blue light, and neuropsin detects UV light. So the thing that I want you to think about is that these are not only expressed in the eye, and that's going to be a critical point because classically, the idea of perceiving light was exclusively thought to be an eye. An eye property, and initially we thought we only had these visual photoreceptors. Then we found out that we had these non-visual melanopsin that could respond to the presence of absence of light, and they're in a specific type of cell called the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cell. But what I'm going to explain to you soon is that there's other tissues in the body, and we're going to come back to the brain about that express these non-visual photoreceptors. So think about the eye as both having a camera and a detective function. And again, the rods and cones are going to help us detect images like the tiger, but the melanopsin is going to help us detect blue light and entrain our circadian rhythm. So back to that sunlight spectrum, and this is just another way of visualizing the first slide, is that what we have and what we can see in that visible light spectrum is going to be from 380 around to 700. And what we can see is that these non-visual photoreceptors have peak absorptions that essentially get triggered by certain light wavelengths. And neuropsin is going to get triggered by non-visible UV light at around 380 nanometers, and melanopsin is triggered by blue light around 480 nanometers. So melanopsin, as I mentioned, is located in the retina, in those specifically intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. But and when those cells get triggered by blue light in the midday, or when you're sitting under artificial light or looking at your iPad at 10 p.m., it sends that midday signal or that daytime signal to your pineal gland via your retinohypothalamic tracts, which are these specific tracts for transmitting this information, and it turns off your melatonin production because it's giving you a daytime signal. So where else is melanopsin located? Well, it's in the skin, it's in blood vessels, it's in the subcutaneous fat, and I'll talk about those in other videos. But significantly, I want to talk about today is it's in your brain, and we have found that melanopsin is expressed inside the brain. So this is a paper that one of the papers that have shown that, and they show that there's a distribution of this melanopsin protein in the human brain. So what they found is that the first study to show that melanopsin exists at the protein level outside of the retinohypothalamic tracts. So again, outside that classical pathway that we use to detect blue light, and it was actually widely distributed in the human brain in all investigated brain areas. So they looked at brain areas that they typically look at when they're trying to diagnose neurodegeneration, and they found that there was melanopsin and in all these areas, including those with importance to regulating essential bodily functions. So think about that in terms of what we talked about in the first paper, which was that light is getting into the brain, and now we know that we've got a blue light detector inside the brain tissue. And that I think is a fascinating proposition. So what else? And this paper more recently in 2016 essentially provided more evidence of that first paper that was done over 40 years ago, and that is that the human brain reacts to transcranial, so light coming from outside, on the cranium, extraocular light. So again, light that isn't being perceived through the eyes, and what they did is they shone light and then measured the impact that it was having on people. And I won't go into the details of the study, but essentially, what they do is they speculate that there might be several mechanisms of action of light on brain function, and they say that deep brain photosensitive molecules, so including enkephalopsin and neuropsin, which are also exist in the brain, have been shown in mice and birds to act as signal transmitters of light. So what do we know is that we know that near infrared light, as it says, can penetrate the skulls of humans, where it increases ATP production in mitochondria, it modulates reactive oxygen species, and induces cellular transcription factors. So what this is just saying that there's more evidence that light, visible light and non-visible light, is having a meaningful effect inside the human brain. So this is, I guess, the next question is, well, what is the implications of this? If our brain is receptive to light and our brain can detect light that is coming in from our environment, not even necessarily from our eyes, then what does this actually mean? Well, it means that your light environment matters, and it means that if you're exposed to artificial isolated blue light, that's going to hijack your melanopsin and your non-visual photoreceptive system, not in a good way. And if you think about the light environment that most people live under, it is exclusively this isolated blue light. And it's not, that blue light is not balanced by infrared or red, which is how it comes when we're exposed in natural sunlight. So if you're not getting outside at all and you're living an indoor existence, you're missing out on these essential near infrared photons. And what is that doing? Well, again, you're not going to be making those antioxidant melatonin hormone inside your mitochondria, but you're also going to be preventing the regeneration of melanopsin. And essentially, melanopsin needs longer wavelength light, longer than 480, to actually regenerate its photoreceptor function. So those are the kind of implications of what's happening. As this pertains to the brain, well, it's not necessarily only that, and we need to think about the other implication is that there's all kinds of ways that we collectively are influencing the way that we're using light. And when we're applying things like sunscreens to the skin, well, if you've got neuropsin, the UV light detector on your skin, but you're wearing sunscreen that contains UVB blocking property, well then you're going to be messing up with that mechanism. If you're going to be wearing sunglasses, then you are also going to be interfering with how neuropsin is going to be signaling inside your eye, and a range of other consequences that I won't mention here. And then the implications also for the blue light environment. So if what's happening if you're holding an iPad that close to your face, and if you remember that study at the beginning, they found that the surgical light 24 inches from the skin was be able to penetrate into the skull. So what's happening to your kid who's holding an iPad that close, again with that 480 nanometer blue light isolated? What is that doing to their non-visual photoreceptor system? What is that doing to them, the melanopsin signaling inside the brain when they're having unfiltered, isolated blue light straight into their heads? And what is the implication for standing under all this artificial light all the time, whether that's in work or at home? And I mean, the potential implications of these long term artificial light and exposure and sunlight deficiency, well, obviously circadian disruption, because we're robbing ourselves of many opportunities for circadian entrainment. Mental health disorders, we know that when you get melanopsin dysfunction, that's a critical, it plays a role in the development of seasonal affective disorders and other kind of mental health disorders. So we could be exacerbating neurodegenerative disorders because, again, we're not, if you think about people sitting in a nursing home indoors who aren't getting infrared light, they're not able to concentrate those photons inside the brain where they're providing an antioxidant effect, which is what they probably need. And then we're going to be having a disrupted hypothalamic pituitary axis hormones. If we're thinking about the concentration of melanopsin in the hypothalamus and how critical the hypothalamus and the pituitary are to programming all our hormonal pathways. So potentially, as the authors of that first paper suggested, that it could influence the sexual development. If it's influencing the testicular size in ducks, well, could it be influencing the testicular size in humans? I think there is good evidence to suggest that. And I've had conversations with Dr. Jack Cruz on my Jack Cruz series where we talked about how light can influence sexual development. The other point is that it also could be influencing thyroid through the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. So those are just some potential implications of these findings. And by no means is this complete. And I really, if you have some if you've joined some more dots or you have some other ideas, please post them in the comments. But I think the point I want to emphasize is that we go back to this concept, which is just like there is junk food, there's also junk light. And that means that we really need to be mindful of our light environment, because even perhaps more than our food environment, our light environment has changed in the past 100 years when we consider the visible and non-visible light that we're now all exposed to. And what is that implication for not only our circadian rhythm, but also things like our non-visual photoreceptor system, and what that might be potentially doing. I think it's too early. We don't know enough, and the implications could be are massive. So the simple message is to really that we need to be blocking artificial light. We need to be mitigating artificial light, and we need to be maximizing sunlight. And that process of what I call it the 3 M's of circadian optimization. That's what I teach in my circadian health course. So if you're interested in some tools to kind of practically implement or mitigate the consequences of what I've just talked about, then join up on my course. The details are on my website, and that's starting every month. So the next one is starting on December the 2nd. So if you found this video interesting, then follow me on YouTube and follow my podcast called the Regenerative Health Podcast, and also on Twitter and X and Instagram. So thanks very much for listening. And like I said, love to hear your thoughts and comments on this video. Please post them below. And I hope you found this interesting. I found it very interesting researching it. Thanks a lot.